I mentioned before introducing Lindsay last time that today and this afternoon we would have, finally, remarks by two of the original founding members of this journal. And first of those two right now is my extraordinarily good friend and much missed colleague, former colleague at Pitt, Jonathan Arac. Some of us have been looking at photographs taken in 1988 in the New York Hilton Hotel, where some of us who also looked a little younger at those days. We're sitting with other colleagues, alive and dead now, forming and creating and signing the papers that created the Boundary 2 Collective and aligned the copyright with Duke University Press, and marking the moment of transition from the Spanos era to the Duke era. Jonathan and I know each other from before that. When he was at Princeton, I was at Columbia. We met via the intermediation of a mutually good friend, Dan O'Hara, who was also one of the founders, who Don graciously invited to be here, but for reasons of health could not make it. I mentioned Jonathan had retired. He had been the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of English at Pittsburgh and the founding director of the Humanities Center, which itself had become a real place of intellectual life on the campus and in the city and in the profession, and had been important to the Boundary 2 Collective as a venue for discussion. I'm sure many of you remember being in that space. He is much missed because of his retirement from that position. He is the author of a very large number of books, many of them of real consequence in the history of the profession and the culture. I'll mention only, for example, his, how old is it now? The book on Huckleberry Finn, is it
1997.
97, so I was going to say 20, 25 years now. Book on Huckleberry Finn as idle and target, the function of criticism in our time, which is an anticipation, a full anticipation of what has become recent discussion in popular and academic culture about the relation between language, representation, power systems, and so on. A book that should have been not only admired academically, but given much more public attention than it had been. His book-length contribution to Sack van Berkovich's Cambridge History of American Literature was published as its own book by Lindsay, in fact, as The Emergence of American Literary Narrative. He's written innumerable essays, and has been, absolutely guiding spirit in the history of the journal for a long time. And for me, I realized my grief at his retirement and departure from the immediate circle of my life as he's moved to the sun and I'm still in the snow, without the sun, so that I don't have my constant point of reference, which Jonathan has been for so long, in practical terms and intellectual and academic terms in my life. So today I am happy to see him again and to invite him to this podium, and I'll tell you that he's giving a paper that I feel I've sort of summoned into being by giving him in his retirement something to do. This is a paper entitled William Empson and the Invention of Modern Literary Study. It belongs to a series of essays Jonathan's been writing recently, sharp, concise, clear, intellectually significant essays about major critics of the last period, including very recently, was it here you read it, in fact, a piece on Joseph Frank. So today, William Empson and Jonathan Arac. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Don. Thank you all. So many things to say and think about Boundary 2, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm going to talk about William Empson now. Since last September, I've been working on William Empson for Boundary 2. I'm doing a review essay on Oxford University Press's 2 recently published volumes in what will become the OUP scholarly edition of the critical works of William Empson, which, at least as listed, does not include on biography, which presumably Harvard still has the copyright in. Using biography, rather, sorry. Anyway, they don't list using biography on. In any case, this proposed 5 volumes really is a mark of Empson's having stepped into the high canon. It's like the Oxford University Press 4-volume edition of critical edition of Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Poets. It's like the familiar but still important old Oxford edition of Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. And with Empson, under the extraordinary impetus of John Haffenden's work, there's a 2-volume biography and a selected letters volume, the 3 volumes together running 2,200 pages. T.S. Eliot, just last year, finally, the complete edition of his prose in a scholarly edition from Johns Hopkins came out. And his letters are still being edited, in fact, by John Haffenden. So that Empson has, as it were, skipped a generation even, and is a little bit ahead of Eliot, and not in his, perhaps, renown by far, but just in his bookshelf canonicity. Now, this talk is not exactly a draft of that commissioned piece, because I'm going to say very little about the edition. Rather, today I'm offering both introductory and reflective materials concerning Empson. He's highly familiar to some of you, less to others, I imagine, and I apologize if I don't find the exact balance. I've known something of Empson since my undergraduate days. He was already a point of reference in the 1960s when I was a student. I attended a talk of his at Adams House at Harvard in the early 1970s. I shared a stage with him at the MLA in 1976, but I've never studied him closely as a whole until Boundary 2 called. Now, does this canonization of Empson mean he's become a relic and we're done with him? Or does he provide some resources for a time when brutal wars of choice have come home to Europe after the post-Cold War, in which it seemed such wars were restricted, for example, to Iraq or Afghanistan? I wouldn't waste our time if I didn't find him relevant now, but it must be said. Empson's work focuses most intensely on 3 centuries of English poetry and poetic drama from the 1590s, roughly to the late 19th century. This means, as a matter of fact, increasingly fewer readers are ready to meet him where his attention falls. And therefore, it's good to have the scholarly edition. I mean, for example, 7 Types of Ambiguity. My last comment. Could use an index. We will have an index when Oxford puts out that volume of the 7 types. And then, like his younger contemporary Doris Lessing, who combated being understood as part of international feminism, Empson attacked literary theory in the attempt to place him in any group that might be designated by that term. In a 1968 essay on Ben Jonson's Volpone, published in the excellent Elliott Pound Heritage Journal Hudson Review, Empson wrote, in defense of the play's rogues, "To become morally independent of one's formative society is the grandest theme of all literature, because it's the only means of moral progress, the establishment of some higher ethical concept." Our modern neo-Christian critics seem to imply that what Jesus Christ did, let alone Robin Hood and Huckleberry Finn, is particularly contemptible to them. They assume that any established orthodoxy must be supported. And here's Lindsay and Stanley on Milton again. Now, that passage from Empson might seem merely romantic in its thematic of morally superior individual versus social conformity, but it also holds very explicitly a hope for collective progress and overall improvement in humans' relation to each other. Also, of course, it struck me, Empson, I can now say with some authority, Empson had little use for American literature or much else about the United States. But Huckleberry Finn was a major exception. He actually makes reference like this to Huckleberry Finn now and again through his oeuvre. I should have known that when I wrote about Huckleberry Finn 30 years ago. One of the funny things for me, in fact, is that questions about America emerged strongly in these months of working with Empson, and you'll see that through this little piece now, they keep coming up. Empson is super English and also unusually, valuably transnational. He was born in 1906, the youngest son of a Yorkshire landowning family. He studied at Cambridge, where he excelled at math and wrote poetry that won him precocious reputation. He then stayed for another year of BA study in English, where his supervisor was I.A. Richards, a pairing even more formidable than roughly contemporaneously at Vanderbilt, where John Crowe Ransom taught Alan Tate and Robert Penn Warren. Empson makes part of a cultural historical knot that still compels fascination, and that's what gave the title that Paul announced me as speaking under. I had given that title, but really I'm only going to say it for this moment and move on to just more Empson in general. A cultural historical knot that still compels fascination. It's well known, but not decisively understood. In the 1920s, across the Anglophone world, young poets responded to the animating shock of Eliot's poetry and then to Richards's Eliot-inspired critical theorizing by becoming path-breaking critics who invented and developed new forms of critical writing. For short, the close reading that new criticism codified. So, speaking now of young poets, R.P. Blackmer, born 1904, working in Cambridge, Mass., though not at Harvard. Robert Penn Warren, born 1905 at Vanderbilt, Empson 1906 at Cambridge. These people were only connected to each other through their reading. They did not know of each other or their work because the young people hadn't yet published their work, but something electric happened. Empson at Cambridge, but he wasn't long for Cambridge. In 1929, after his work with Richards, he won a prize fellowship. But appallingly, while his student rooms were being cleaned out for his move to new fellows' digs, the staff found in his drawers what he calls in a letter, birth control mechanisms, condoms. And he was expunged from the college books within 48 hours. His expulsion made him unemployable in the schools of his homeland. Not until 1953 did he hold an English university post. The intervening years make him remarkably worldly among the prestigious British critics of the 20th century. For a few years, he holed up in London seeking journalistic opportunity and perfecting his first book, which he had already begun drafting while a student. 7 Types of Ambiguity appeared in 1930 from the same trade publisher, Chatto and Windus, that a few years later published his first book of poems. So, came out in 1930, 92 years later, it's still in print and about to become a scholarly classic. It's often called the first book of modern criticism. Many would also call it a book of theory. Unlike what became textbook new criticism, and I suppose textbook new criticism means the protocols of Brooks and Warren's understanding poetry, themselves codified in the practice of Cleanth Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn, 1947. Let's take that as the codification. But unlike textbook new criticism, Empson is not devoted to proving the poetic coherence of whole works. His job is unfolding the beauties, that is, the strangenesses that stick in memory, of small pieces of language in poems. I'm not the first to find precedent for this practice in Longinus, part over whole, ambiguity as the new sublime. Like the Greek treatise on the sublime, Empson is also concerned with the character and quality of the poet's mind and of the reader's mind, and further with the interrelations, the interactions between the poet and the reader. To tweak the terminology of M.H. Abrams in The Mirror and the Lamp, the strength of Empson's expressive and affective concerns means that his formalism is never objective. So just a taste of 7 types of ambiguity drawn from the 7th chapter, the last type of ambiguity, full contradiction, marking a division in the author's mind. This chapter makes explicit reference to Freud, a still legible cross-disciplinarity that helps explain the book's claim as theory. Chapter 7 concludes with the book's only 2 full readings, both poems by priests. The Victorian Jesuit Gerard Manley Hopkins, The Windhover, and the early 17th century Anglican George Herbert, The Sacrifice. Both those readings proved controversial, and decades later, Empson was still defending them ever more vehemently as his views on Christianity sharpened. I'll stick to some of the warm-up in Chapter 7, not leaving aside the readings, as Empson introduces his perspective on this complex mode of feeling and writing. Alexander Pope begins his essay on man. Expatiate free o'er all this scene of man, a mighty maze, but not without a plan. Empson notes that the poet revised the 2nd line after friends pointed out a contradiction. It had originally read, a mighty maze and all without a plan. Empson observes for a sentence or two the complicated relationship between maze and plan, and then moves on. After suggesting that poets may convey opposing feelings to the reader, I quote this, by some disorder in the action of the negative. He moves on to the opening of Keats's Ode on Melancholy, which Paul wrote about some in a recent book. No, no, go not to Lethe, neither twist it. This wording, Empson argues, quote, tells you that somebody or some force in the poet's mind must have wanted to go to Lethe very much if it took 4 negatives in the first line to stop them. Next come the last lines spoken by Dr. Faustus in Marlowe's play. My God, look not so sharp upon me. Adders and serpents, let me breathe a while. Ugly hell, gape not. Come not, Lucifer. I'll burn my books. Mephistopheles. Empson's great formalistic response asserts, controversially, there is no stress as a matter of scansion on the negatives, so that the main meaning is a shuddering acceptance. I tried in reading to give you the stresses on the verbs, not on the negatives, although one must say, depending on what you mean by strictly scansion, my God, look not. So, the meter gives us the stress, but I think we'll all agree that the proper oral performance stresses the verb rather than the negation. But in any case, Empson doesn't rest with that first observation. Beyond this, Empson finds also, quoting now, a demand for the final intellectual curiosity at whatever cost to be satisfied. And he rewrites the lines to make his point. Let ugly hell gape. Show me Lucifer. Empson continues. Faustus is being broken. His meanings are jarring in his mouth. One cannot recite ugly hell gape not as a direct imperative, like stop gaping there. And with the last two words, Mephistopheles, he is falling to the devil like a tired child. Empson's commentary emphasizes the oral performance as a resource for insight. And this is an aspect of his overall critical stance that certainly can cause trouble for Americans, since the English spoken language is not the same as the American spoken language, leaving aside all the variations within each. Okay, we'll return to that issue. From 1931 to 1934, Empson held a faculty position at a Japanese university in Tokyo, where I.A. Richards's recommendation carried weight that it could not in the morally outraged England. Within a month of Empson's arrival, Japan invaded Manchuria, and Empson saw the nationalist impact on his students of this war going on. He did not learn Japanese, but he became seriously interested in the Buddha and took viewing expeditions, eventually across much of Asia, that laid the ground for his book, The Face of the Buddha, published only first in 2016 because the typescript was lost in the aftermath of the war. During his time in Tokyo, Empson completed his second book, Some Versions of Pastoral, 1935. Readers have found this book brilliant but puzzling, because it's all variation but no theme. Empson treats no works that meet the conventional definition of pastoral, namely sophisticated poets writing about simple shepherds. The closest he comes is in the medieval mystery play, The Second Shepherd's Play from the Wakefield cycle. Instead, Empson treats a range of examples that show what he defines as the pastoral structure, namely addressing the complex, life itself, through the simple. And as it develops, the simple is any literary representation, actually, but particularly certain kinds of double structures. So the complex through the simple, with ironic awareness that each of the two realms is both better and worse than the other. Here's a passage from the first chapter on the very 1935 chapter title of Proletarian Literature. The realistic sort of pastoral gives a natural expression for a sense of social injustice. So far as the person described is outside society because too poor for its benefits, he's independent, as the artist claims to be, and can be a critic of society. So far as he is forced by this into crime, he is the judge of the society that judges him. This is a source of irony both against him and against the society. And if he is a sympathetic criminal, he could be made to suggest both Christ as the scapegoat and the sacrificial tragic hero, who is normally above society rather than below it, which is a further source of irony. Dostoevsky is always using these ideas, perhaps unhelpfully, but as very strong propaganda. This passage, among many through Empson's work, reminds me of Kenneth Burke. Partly, it's that both had read and used many of the same psychological and anthropological materials while maintaining left perspectives. But above all, both Empson and Burke continued through all the Marx, Freud, Fraser to value words. 1935 is also the year of Burke's controversial essay, Revolutionary Symbolism in America, where he recommended that American communists consider their target audience not as, quote, workers or as, quote, the masses, but as, quote, the people. After a few more years back in London on Grub Street, Empson gained another opportunity from Richards, a professorship at Peking University. He arrived in 1937. Within a few weeks, he was fleeing from the Japanese invasion with the rest of the students and faculty to one after another location ever further south and west within China. As war spread to Europe, Empson returned to London in 1939, and he served the BBC as Chinese editor for the Overseas Service. At this point, Empson effectively stopped writing poems. Empson's much admired younger friend, Christopher Ricks, many years later, explained that Empson's marriage ended his poetic writing. But Empson wrote a letter to Ricks to set him straight. I thought it a gap, a limitation in your mind, that you cannot imagine a man taking a real interest in public affairs. It was not marriage that ended Empson's writing poetry. Rather, says Empson, I dropped all my literary interests, even reviewing, because I got so absorbed in the war. I thought the defeat of Hitler so important that I could do nothing else. And then Empson explained further, after the war, the politics that had motivated 30s poetry, including his, which is formally very different from that of the so-called Pylon School or the Auden School. But he shared those political sympathies, but those politics had been blown out like a candle. His war job was propaganda, and he relished it. He worked closely with George Orwell, who held a similar post responsible for India. After the war, Empson returned to Peking U. He lived there through the revolutionary seizure of the city and taught for several years of the communist regime. Here's a statement that he wrote in and for Peking in the late 1950. It is of great importance that writers and other artists should try to keep a certain world-mindedness. That is one of the reasons why I am an Englishman living in Peking and feel I may have a certain usefulness here. Without the literatures, you cannot have a sense of history, and history is like the balancing pole of the tightrope walker. And nowadays, we very much need the longer balancing pole, not of national, but of world history. In 1950, his third book, The Structure of Complex Words, appeared, most of which had been drafted before the war. I mean, this is an amazing thing, actually, that Empson's first three books, which appeared from 1930 to 50, were effectively all written in the 30s. In 1953, he then returned to England and took up the professorship of English at Sheffield U, where he remained till his retirement in 71. The Structure of Complex Words, Lindsay's book, is Empson's longest and hardest book. It rewards intensive reading, yet it's also both flawed and unsuccessful. It has close cousinship to Raymond Williams's keywords, and Empson uses the phrase key word. Both Empson and Williams draw on the resources of the OED, as Empson had begun doing already in 7 Types of Ambiguity. The OED, bear in mind, originally appeared in fascicles, and the final fascicle completing the OED appeared only in 1928, the year Empson began his studies with Richards. They both use the resources of the OED to analyze and trace changes in meaning over the complex histories of words as people have used them. And I underline as people have used them because in their different ways, both Empson and Williams are sociolinguists, and in that respect, rather different from the OED and their goals and methods. They both go beyond the OED. Yet these two major critics, Empson and Williams, never found common ground, which I began to find all the more surprising as I learned from this intensive biographical study how overall lefty Empson's views were, though only his wife was ever a communist. The issue must be something like social sensibility. Is that just a fancy way of saying class background? I don't know. I mean, Williams did sort of okay with Perry Anderson, after all. But I think it can be brought down more concretely to Williams's primary concern with the terms of public debate, especially in the press, while Empson is especially concerned with the terms of interpersonal interaction. And so, quoting from an early chapter of The Structure of Complex Words, a good case of this kind would be the Victorian matron saying, "You can't take Amelia for long walks, Mr. Jones. She's delicate." For Empson, these coded social terms give what he calls period feeling. And the buried large project of the book traces a history from the Elizabethans into the 19th century via a transit from the Christian fool, the word fool, to Wordsworth's sense. Empson gives special weight to a cluster of words such as arch, rogue, honest, and dog that change in the Restoration as what Empson calls a covert defense against Christianity. These words were part of a slang, he says, not a liturgy, and carry a covert cargo of counter values, quoting him, pride rather than humility, self-realization rather than self-denial, caste rather than either the communion of saints or the individual soul. So this secret language of the outcast superior minority, maybe it's Bernard Williams, would have seemed, I think, for Williams too Bloomsbury, and for an American, perhaps merely inaccessible. Empson published one more book in his life, Milton's God, 1961. This book argues against Christianity as a religion based on torture, and it praises Milton for making the best possible case as advocate to justify the ways of God, God being the worst possible client. Empson was shocked to discover the state of the British Academy after nearly a quarter century away. He'd been teaching English literature all that time, except for the BBC years, but never in a Christian country. He found conservative timidity, both religious and political. Empson blamed the later Eliot for this. And Americans had become prominent, bringing dreadful prose and cringing revulsion from anything that might challenge current political structures. Boundary 2 has been trying to better America in at least these two dimensions, and many of you have read Paul Beauvais' admirable use of Milton's God to conclude Paul's poetry and torture. I'll close with two emphases on America, one in academic prose, the other in poetry. Empson's reading of Herbert's The Sacrifice met challenge from the American Renaissance scholar Rosamond Tuve. Tuve died rather young in the early 1960s, and when I was in the neo-Christian Princeton English department in the 1970s, her memory was really sacred. She argued that everything Empson found animating and challenging in Herbert's poem was commonplace since the Middle Ages. He disagreed. He made a good case for his disagreement, but before publishing his disagreement, like Lindsay, he wrote her to warn her it was coming. That was his standard practice, it seems from the letters, and some exchange ensued. She and Empson were roughly contemporaries, and yet in their correspondence, he addresses her from the heart of his own writing practice as if she were a student to be instructed and inspired. Not out of here yet. It's not just a job, he insists. Please feel that making a book of criticism can be a thing you would like to do in your periods of leisure for personal satisfaction, and yet that the enormous labor of rewriting 12 times, as he always said he did, is only aimed at making yourself intelligible or directly convincing to the ordinary, tolerably informed reader. Unless you feel that, you will not write decently at all. By good writing, I mean directing yourself to the mind of the public you can reasonably expect once you aim at getting outside your own clique. He then goes on to say that, however, in her books, alas, you cannot get from one clause to another of one sentence without spreading a complete fog all round any reader about what you're trying to say. This is a deeply respected style in America, highly paid for in subsidized magazines. So, American prose is a fog, and American poetry a blank. Empson loved what he called the standard singing line of English poetry, and he regretted, he's writing now around 1960, he regretted that Americans felt constrained to renounce its pleasure. He continues, opinion about William Carlos Williams makes the position clear, I think. English critics don't feel he's a poet at all. But the most unexpected American critics will be found speaking of him with tender reverence. They feel he's a kind of saint. He has renounced all the pleasures of the English language so that he is completely American. And he only says the dullest things, so he has won the terrible fight to become completely democratic. And then Empson reconsiders his position, not his position on Williams, but his position on the singing line. Perhaps giving up song is not always a renunciation. And I will conclude with his affirmation. He relishes a language impenetrable to Americans and not to be confused with its demonic double in Henry James, an American who thought he could write like an Englishman. Empson says, though externally drab, the delicious social hints and evasive claims by mumble of spoken English are a positive intoxication. So that's my anthropological inquiry into the mind of an Englishman. Yes.
Jonathan, it occurs to me listening to you that one of the pleasures I've always had listening to you is the incredible way you fit the intelligence of your presentation to your audience. And you were obviously thinking about that in thinking about Empson. I mean, that's not a question.
Yeah, no, I mean, undoubtedly, imagining this room.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask you, kind of in the spirit of the 50 years of Boundary 2, and in the spirit of you and I being over 70, do you recognize a change in the way you have had to imagine your audience as you've been writing criticism over these last decades, or addressing Boundary 2 over the last decades?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think my belief happily realized that Charles would be here made me more sensitive to thinking about Empson's views both on the American and on the spoken voice of performance. So that to phrase that in terms of a larger project of the journal, when the Young Turks met it and took it over in the 80s, the Young Turks, namely the old farts of today, the journal had made its impact, I think, especially in response to certain elements, well known to us now, broadly the Olson line of American poetry in the post-war years. And we were, for a while, very much emphasizing what was not alien to that body of poetry as mediated through Bill Spanos, but was certainly different from it. The theory conversation that, for example, allowed me to appear in the Theory and History of Literature series, along with other people even in this room, during those heady years that Lindsay brought it into existence with Vlad and Jochen. But in more recent years, for the last 20 years at least, maybe more, Boundary 2 has renewed its concern much more directly with the practice of poetry, and I think that in turn owes something to the formulation that we arrived at about 20 years ago in changing our submissions policy, where the formulation involving imagining alternatives, I think, has been felt, and rightly, to have perhaps reopened is too strong, but in any case, to bring poetry to the front of thought again for the journal. That's my thought on that, which others may take differently. Yes, Lindsay?
You talked a little bit, I'm interested in more about Empson and Asia, and
Yeah.
and what other, can you say more about that?
Well, I wish I could say more. I know.
Because
that-
he was there for so long, right?
Yes, he was. And so, I mean, one of the things that I am told is that his years in Peking meant that he had a large impact on the study of literature in English in China. And when I was myself first in China in 95 and 97, I did meet people who claimed to have, and perhaps could have been shown to have been, present at certain moments, that is, older Chinese scholars who were there when Empson was, but at that time, I was simply in no position to turn on my tape recorder. Somebody, you would hope, actually has been able to document something of what that meant, but I don't.
What did Q.S. Tong write about Empson? Or did he?
I don't remember. What I have not done is reviewed that at the moment. That is, it's not in my current mind. Paul, can you briefly comment?
By the time I was settled in Hong Kong more, a little later than those moments in the 90s,
Yeah.
Political turns went through moments like China and the West, China and the rest, China alone, yes. And at various moments when Empson's name appeared in that period, say between 2004 and 2016, that seems right, that 12-year period. And QS is the example here. The interest in Empson had transformed into a discussion of the way in which he carried English practical criticism. English basic English. I. Richard's Principles of Basic English to China as a colonial operation, because basic English was created essentially as a practice by and for the English occupation of India, transmogrified back into the technologies of the classroom in the Tripos in Cambridge, and then exported, so the story goes, then exported via Empson, who was a sapper of Chinese culture by bringing basic English.
And it's certainly true from the documentation in the letters and the biography that during his time in China, Empson was concerned with basic English. He did a piece that grew out of his Chinese experience, but that appeared, I forget, it appeared in print in 1940, and I'm trying to remember if it actually was in the Kenyon Review, but in any case, it appeared in print in English in 1940 on Wordsworth and basic English. And more broadly, he thought, and especially he thought for the Americans, translating what you have to say as a critic into basic English helps you know what you really have to say. From there, you may decide that you want to re-elaborate the language. But he did consider it a rather salutary exercise. Now, apropos the story about Empson's role as circulated in China when Paul was there, Empson and Richards were in conflict about the politics of basic English in certain respects. I don't mean the macro politics, is it colonial or not, but rather the micro politics. Was Empson handling the situation in the right way from Richards's point of view, since Richards had the more proprietary position vis-a-vis basic English? Yeah.
How long did Empson write poetry? And because there was a while when people in England thought his poetry was extremely valuable.
Yes.
What's his most prominent poem? Is the one called Missing Dates? Maybe?
Yeah, that's certainly his most prominent poem, I think. But so basically, he wrote his poetry in the 30s. There are a few pieces that he wrote later.
Did he talk about drying up after that? Or?
Well, I mean, what he said in his letter to Ricks. So in the mid-70s, this is Ricks. Empson having retired, has begun to be treated as a revered figure and a figure of historical reflection within England, and Ricks had written something that talked about Empson as a poet and said, after his marriage he didn't really write poetry, although in fact Haffenden in his bio publishes for the first time a poem in praise of his wife by Empson, but that was never published in his lifetime. But at least it proves that his marriage didn't keep him from writing poetry. So Ricks seems to have imagined just a diversion of energies, Empson says, yeah, it was a diversion of energies, but the reason was because I was giving all my being to the war effort, and contrary to the misunderstanding that the Cambridge poets were the left political poets and Empson was somehow an Eleotic freak, Empson says, and it's plausible, that the politics of my poetry were always the same as theirs. It's simply that the way I wrote poetry I couldn't write poetry their way. The only way I could write poetry was the poems that I wrote. But nonetheless, the politics had been part of the animation of it. And after the war, when you had a labor government and a national health service and a welfare state, well, the 30s poetry had lost its reason for being. And of course, the 30s poets found that to be true too. Yeah, Don.
It's a wonderful talk and extremely clarifying. You focus on the relationship between Empson and Williams around key words.
Yeah.
And you excavate 4 words that you suggest Empson has associated with a transformation of ethos. Those words all seem to be involved in a kind of vectoral relation that seems to evoke, at least in my hearing, Williams' notion of structure of feeling. Mm-hmm. Did Empson have the sense that these key words, which were to enable a transition, a transformational transition from a Christian to something other than that, did he associate these with affective structures? Does the very notion of ambiguity have as one of its necessary components a disambiguation that would involve the visceral as well as the cognitive?
Well, I think that that for Empson, something that could be called the visceral is absolutely part of what he engages in his exfoliation of ambiguities. That is, it seems to me that, gape hell, show me Lucifer. I mean, that's at the guts of things, I think. But Empson doesn't use a language of viscerality, but he certainly thinks that the task of reading ambiguity, reading poetic ambiguity, that is to say, of understanding why this particular moment in a poem, or even this particular whole small poem, seems to you so powerful and beautiful and wonderful and strange, this engages you all the way through. Engaging ambiguity is not primarily, although it's not primarily an analytic exercise, although it necessarily takes the form of analysis in order to get one thing said and then another said.
But do you think that this was one of the reasons why his authority as a critic was linked to the appropriation of his ethos by the pedagogical imperatives of the American new critics?
Well, actually, I have not explored whether there is a body of memoir concerning Empson's classroom. If somebody knows of that body, share it with me, please. But I don't know of it. However, in his response to John Carey, the British critic's inaugural lecture in his professorship at Oxford, in response to Carey's inaugural lecture, which raked Empson over the coals for being a paraphraser, and paraphrase is, for Carey, not the thing. Paraphrase is taking us away from the words of the poem. Empson wrote a savage paragraph about what the classroom must be like for a teacher like this. And what he says basically is that paraphrase is the only way that you, the student, can begin to engage the relationship of the poem to you, because you're putting it in your words. And you saw, in fact, that Empson himself is willing not just to paraphrase, but to metaphrase, if we will, in his response to Marlowe. And so for him, the heresy of paraphrase means listen to the teacher and report what the teacher says, and don't you allow anything of your own to get into it. So he, of course, could have been appropriated, but he didn't think that was what he meant or said or did. Paul?
In 1966, reflecting before Boundary 2, in 1966 I was taking a year-long honors English poetry course with a then recently brand new PhD from Yale who had studied with Clanth Brooks. There were three required, there were only 4 poets, by the way, read in the entire year: Chaucer, Milton, Wordsworth, and Eliot. And there were 3 critical books assembled as the guidebooks. The Well-Wrought Urn, 7 Types, and the Verbal Icon. And so in the hands of a Yale new critic, fresh out of the Clanth Brooks mint, the only thing that was in any way exceptional, well, actually 2 things were exceptional there. One was the Milton, which you would not have expected, I think, for the Protestantism. And then the other was the Wordsworth, which you would not have expected at all because there was no irony in Wordsworth. So went the Clanth.
Right.
But that was at the moment when suddenly the movement to draw the great English romantics into the shadow of the metaphysicals was beginning to emerge.
Yeah, as it already had in the well-wrought Earth.
Yeah. So that became the canonical, for me, for quite a long time, the canonical Empson. And all the rest of it was not given to me at any time. And what was there was only because it was classroom pedagogy value, not because it had anything really to say theoretically or whatever. And certainly it wasn't offered as an example of paraphrase, but as the problems with what paraphrase might represent.
Yeah, I mean, that historical archive that you just remembered is lovely to have. Empson hated, not personally, but on the page, hated Wimsatt. He has a really nasty thing to say about the picture of Wimsatt that accompanied the 1954 publication of the verbal icon. I don't even know if he knew that Wimsatt was just short of 7 feet tall, but he describes just the facial picture as, you know, like a monster rising dripping from the swamp. And he believed that the intentional fallacy was a ban on understanding poetry. So, how Catholic in the best sense that your teacher included Brooks, Wimsatt, and Empson too.
Well, interesting, of course, they had all been coerced into an apparatus.
Yeah. But I mean, the Yale Major Poets course, certainly as far back as I know it, did include Milton and Wordsworth.
Yeah.
So, okay. Are
I'm glad that
you
brought out
done
this
with
new
me?
edition I got you to